I was arranging fresh flowers in my garden when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional and slightly annoyed, asking why I hadn't responded to the invoice for my daughter's wedding venue. I told her there must be some mistake. I didn't know anything about a wedding. There was a long pause before she said something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Patterson, you're listed as the financial guarantor for the entire event. The deposit alone is $35,000. I stood there with dirt under my fingernails and my heart in my throat, trying to understand how I could be paying for a wedding I wasn't invited to. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Patterson, and at 57 years old, I thought I had finally figured out how to navigate the complicated relationship I had with my daughter Vanessa. For the past 3 years, we had maintained what I called a cordial distance. We texted on birthdays and holidays. We exchanged pleasantries about weather and work. We never talked about anything that mattered, and I had convinced myself that this shallow peace was better than the alternative. The wedding planner's name was Christine Wu, and she sounded like someone who had dealt with difficult family dynamics before. Her voice softened when she realized I genuinely had no idea what she was talking about. She explained that Vanessa had booked the Sterling Rose estate for a June wedding, just 3 months away. The contract listed me as the primary contact and financial guarantor. My signature was on file, or at least what appeared to be my signature. I asked her to email me everything, and within minutes my inbox filled with documents I had never seen before. Contracts for venues, caterers, florists, photographers. Each one bore a signature that looked remarkably like mine but wasn't. The total came to over $120,000, and according to the payment schedule, the first installment of $40,000 was due in 2 weeks. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the guest list Christine had attached. 230 names, many of whom I recognized as Vanessa's friends and extended family members. My name wasn't on it. My sister Julia wasn't on it. None of my side of the family appeared anywhere on that list. It was as if we had been carefully erased from what should have been a family celebration. I called Vanessa immediately, but it went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. On the third attempt, I left a message that I tried to keep calm but probably failed. I told her about Christine's call and asked her to please call me back as soon as possible. Then I sat in my garden surrounded by the roses I had spent 15 years cultivating and tried to understand what was happening. Vanessa was my only child, born when I was 25 and still trying to figure out who I was. Her father, David, had been charming and successful, and I had loved him with the kind of intensity that young people mistake for compatibility. We had built what looked like a perfect life in our suburban neighborhood. David worked in commercial real estate and made good money. I taught elementary school and loved my job. Vanessa grew up with dance classes and summer camps and college funds. But perfection is exhausting when it's just a performance. David had expectations about how his wife should look, how his home should be maintained, how his daughter should behave. He never raised his hand to either of us, but his disappointment could fill a room like poison gas. When Vanessa was 12, she spilled red wine on his mother's antique tablecloth during a dinner party. The look on David's face made Vanessa cry for hours afterward, even though he never said a word to her about it. He just removed the tablecloth, threw it in the trash, and continued dinner as if nothing had happened. I should have left him then. I should have recognized that kind of silent punishment for what it was. Instead, I spent the next 6 years teaching Vanessa how to be perfect, how to anticipate David's moods, how to make herself smaller so that his disappointment would have less to hit. By the time she left for college at 18, she was a master at reading rooms and adjusting herself to fit whatever was expected. The divorce happened during her sophomore year. David had been having an affair with someone from his office, and when I confronted him about it, he seemed almost relieved. He told me I had become boring, that I had let myself go, that he needed someone who understood ambition. The divorce was brutal and public. He fought me on everything out of spite rather than necessity. He told our friends I was unstable and vindictive. He made sure Vanessa knew that I was the one who had destroyed our family by not being enough. Vanessa took his side. She was 19 and angry, and maybe she needed someone to blame. She told me I had driven him away with my neediness and my expectations. She said I should have tried harder to make him happy. She spent that entire summer at his new apartment with his new girlfriend, and when she came back to school in the fall, she barely spoke to me for 2 years. We had slowly rebuilt something over the following years, but it was fragile and covered in unspoken resentments. Vanessa had graduated, gotten a good job at a marketing firm, moved into a nice apartment downtown. She had mentioned a boyfriend named Trevor a few times over the past year, but the conversations were always brief and surface level. She had never suggested I meet him. She had never invited me to her apartment. We were like distant acquaintances who happened to share DNA and a painful history. And now, apparently, she was getting married and had forged my signature on contracts totaling more than $100,000. My phone finally rang at 8 that evening. Vanessa's voice was tight and defensive before I even said hello. She told me she knew why I was calling and that I needed to calm down. I asked her how she expected me to be calm when I had just discovered I was supposedly paying for a wedding I knew nothing about. She let out a bitter laugh that reminded me so much of her father it made my chest ache. She said the wedding planner wasn't supposed to call me yet, that she had planned to tell me about everything once more details were finalized. I asked her why my signature was on financial documents I had never seen, and there was a long pause before she admitted that Trevor's mother had helped her fill out the initial paperwork. They had assumed I would want to pay for my daughter's wedding like any normal mother would. They had assumed I would be grateful to be included. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I asked her directly if she had forged my signature, and she said it wasn't forgery because she was my daughter and I should have offered to pay anyway. I asked her why I wasn't on the guest list if I was supposed to be financing the entire event. Another pause, longer this time, filled with the kind of tension that comes before something breaks. Vanessa told me that Trevor's family had concerns about my presence at the wedding. David had apparently shared stories about how unstable I had been during the divorce, how I had tried to turn Vanessa against him, how I had made everything difficult. Trevor's parents were traditional and conservative, and they thought it would be better if the wedding focused on Trevor's family and friends, rather than dredging up complicated family dynamics from Vanessa's past. I sat there in my quiet house, listening to my daughter explain why I wasn't good enough to attend her wedding but was expected to pay for it anyway, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. I asked her if she understood what she was asking of me. She said I was being dramatic and that if I really loved her, I would want her to have the wedding of her dreams regardless of whether I was personally invited. I told her I wouldn't be signing any contracts or paying any invoices. I told her that forging my signature was actually illegal, and that she needed to contact all the vendors immediately to remove my name from their files. Vanessa's voice went from defensive to furious. She said I was ruining everything just like I had ruined her childhood and her relationship with her father. She said I was selfish and bitter, and that she should have known I would find a way to make her wedding about me. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to make anything about me, but that I couldn't allow her to commit fraud using my identity. She told me that Trevor's family had already put down deposits based on my supposed financial guarantee, that if I backed out now, they would lose tens of thousands of dollars, that I owed her this after all the years of making her life difficult. The conversation ended with Vanessa screaming that she never wanted to speak to me again and hanging up. I sat in the dark for a long time afterward, trying to understand how we had gotten here. How the little girl who used to climb into my lap to read stories had become this angry stranger who thought I owed her $100,000 for a party I wasn't invited to. The next morning I called my attorney. Richard Chun had handled my divorce from David, and he knew the whole messy history. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment before asking me to send him all the documentation Christine had provided. Within an hour he called me back with news that made everything worse. The signature on the contracts wasn't just similar to mine. It was a digital copy of my actual signature, probably scanned from some old document Vanessa had access to. The contracts were legally binding, and the vendors could potentially sue me for breach of contract if the payments weren't made. Richard said we could fight it on the basis of fraud, but it would be expensive and public and would almost certainly destroy whatever remained of my relationship with Vanessa. He asked me what I wanted to do, and I realized I didn't know. Part of me wanted to let the whole thing collapse, to let Vanessa face the consequences of her actions. But another part of me, the part that still remembered her as a little girl in a pink tutu, couldn't quite bring myself to do that. Richard suggested I think about it for a few days before making any decisions. He said he would send cease and desist letters to the vendors in the meantime, informing them that the contracts were potentially fraudulent and that I was disputing any financial responsibility. That afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Patricia Winters, Trevor's mother. Her voice had the kind of practiced warmth that wealthy people use when they want something from you. She said she understood there had been some confusion about the wedding arrangements, and that she hoped we could discuss it like reasonable adults. I asked her if she knew that my signature had been forged on legal documents, and there was a brief pause before she said that Vanessa had explained the situation. Patricia said that young people sometimes make impulsive decisions, but that shouldn't derail such an important life event.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She suggested that perhaps we could work out a payment plan that would be manageable for me, something that would allow the wedding to proceed without any legal complications. I asked her directly if she knew I wasn't invited to the wedding, and her careful tone slipped for just a moment. She said that David had shared some concerns about my mental stability and my tendency toward dramatic gestures. She said that Vanessa had been very clear about wanting a peaceful, joyful celebration without any potential disruptions. She assured me it wasn't personal, just a practical decision to ensure the day went smoothly. Something about her condescending tone, the way she spoke about me as if I were a problem to be managed rather than the mother of the bride, made my decision for me. I told Patricia that I wouldn't be paying for any portion of the wedding, and that my attorney would be handling all further communication. She tried to interrupt to explain that I was being unreasonable, but I ended the call before she could finish. Within an hour, my phone was flooded with messages. Vanessa sent a series of increasingly angry texts calling me vindictive and selfish. David sent an email saying I was once again proving that I cared more about control than about our daughter's happiness. People I hadn't spoken to in years, old mutual friends from the marriage, started reaching out to tell me they had heard about the situation and thought I should reconsider. The pressure was intense and coordinated. Someone had clearly spread the story through our old social circle, painting me as the unreasonable mother who was sabotaging her daughter's wedding out of spite. My phone buzzed constantly with messages telling me I was wrong, that mothers are supposed to sacrifice for their children, that I would regret this decision for the rest of my life. I turned off my phone and sat in my garden, the place where I had always felt most myself. I had planted these roses after the divorce, each bush representing something I was trying to build in my new life. Independence, peace, self-respect. The garden had grown beautiful over the years, a testament to patience and consistent care. I realized that I had been so focused on cultivating beauty in my external world that I had neglected to protect myself from people who wanted to take advantage of that growth. That night, I drafted an email to Vanessa. I told her that I loved her, and that I hoped she would have a beautiful wedding and a happy marriage. I told her that I understood she was angry with me, and that I took responsibility for the mistakes I had made as her mother. But I also told her that I couldn't allow her to commit fraud using my identity, and that I couldn't enable her belief that I owed her a six-figure payment for an event I wasn't welcome to attend. I told her that when she was ready to have an honest conversation about our relationship, about the ways we had both been hurt and the ways we had hurt each other, I would be here. But until then, I needed to protect myself and my financial security. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and then I allowed myself to cry for the first time since Christine's initial phone call. The next 2 weeks were brutal. Richard's cease and desist letters created chaos with the vendors. Some of them threatened lawsuits. Others simply canceled the services and kept the deposits. Vanessa and Trevor scrambled to either find new vendors or come up with the money themselves. My phone continued to buzz with angry messages from people who thought they knew the whole story. But something unexpected happened too. My sister Julia called and asked if I wanted company. She drove 3 hours to spend the weekend with me, and we talked about things we hadn't discussed in years. She told me she had always thought I sacrificed too much for people who didn't appreciate it. She said she was proud of me for finally setting a boundary, even though it was painful. Other people started reaching out too. Old friends from teaching who had stayed in touch over the years. Former colleagues who had watched me rebuild my life after the divorce. They told me they had heard different versions of the story and wanted to know my side. When I explained what had actually happened, several of them admitted they weren't surprised. They said David had always been good at controlling narratives and that Vanessa had learned that skill from him. One evening, about 3 weeks after Christine's initial call, I received an unexpected visitor. A young woman knocked on my door and introduced herself as Monica-chan, Christine's assistant from the wedding planning company. She looked nervous and kept glancing over her shoulder as if she was afraid of being seen. She asked if she could come in and talk to me privately. Monica told me that she had felt uncomfortable about the situation from the beginning. She said Christine had tried to reach me multiple times before the first phone call, but all the contact information on file had been wrong. When Christine finally got through to me, Monica had started looking more carefully at the contracts and noticed several irregularities. She said she had reported her concerns to Christine, who had confronted Vanessa about it. According to Monica, Vanessa had broken down and admitted that she had forged my signature because she wanted the wedding her mother-in-law was planning but couldn't afford it herself. Trevor's family had offered to pay for part of it, but they had expectations about the scale and style that went far beyond what Vanessa and Trevor could manage alone. Vanessa had convinced herself that I owed her a dream wedding after what she perceived as a difficult childhood. Monica said she was telling me this because she thought I deserved to know the truth, but also because she was worried about Vanessa. During their conversation, Vanessa had said things that suggested she was under tremendous pressure from Trevor's family to present a certain image. Monica said it reminded her of situations she had seen before where young brides got caught up in trying to please their in-laws and lost sight of what really mattered. I thanked Monica for her honesty and asked her not to get in trouble on my account. After she left, I sat with this new information and tried to decide what it meant. Part of me felt vindicated. Vanessa had admitted to the forgery, which meant I wasn't being unreasonable or vindictive. But another part of me recognized something familiar in Monica's description. The pressure to be perfect, the fear of disappointing people, the desperate attempt to make everyone happy except yourself. I had taught Vanessa those patterns, not intentionally, but through my own example of constantly adjusting myself to fit David's expectations. I had shown her how to sacrifice your truth for the appearance of harmony, and now she was repeating those patterns with Trevor's family, so desperate for their approval that she was willing to commit fraud and destroy her relationship with her own mother. For weeks after the initial phone call, I received a letter in the mail. Real mail, handwritten, not an email or text. The envelope had Vanessa's handwriting on it, and my hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a 3-page letter that started with an apology. Vanessa wrote that the wedding had been canceled. Trevor's family had withdrawn their financial support when the fraud situation became public, and Trevor himself had started questioning whether they were ready for marriage. She wrote that losing the wedding had felt like the end of the world at first, but then it had forced her to look at what she had been willing to do to make it happen. She wrote about finding my old journals from the years of my marriage to David. She had been looking for documents that might have my signature on them when she came across boxes I had stored in her childhood bedroom. She had read about my attempts to be perfect, my fear of David's disappointment, my gradual disappearance into the role of wife and mother until I forgot who I was underneath. Vanessa wrote that reading those journals had been like looking in a mirror. She realized she had been doing the same thing with Trevor and his family. She had been so desperate to fit their vision of the perfect bride that she had lost sight of what she actually wanted. She had been willing to commit fraud, to destroy her relationship with her mother, to erase her own history, all to gain the approval of people who would probably never fully accept her anyway. The letter ended with a request. Vanessa asked if I would be willing to meet with her, not to discuss the wedding or the money, but to talk honestly about our relationship and the patterns we had both fallen into. She said she understood if I needed more time, but that she was finally ready to stop performing and start being real. I read that letter 3 times and each time I felt something different. Anger at the pain she had caused, relief that she was finally seeing clearly, hope that maybe we could build something authentic between us, and underneath it all, the same fierce protective love I had felt the day she was born. I called her that evening and we talked for 3 hours. Really talked in a way we hadn't since she was a child. We talked about David and the ways his need for control had damaged both of us. We talked about the divorce and how I had failed to protect her from his manipulation of the narrative. We talked about the wedding and why she had been willing to go to such extremes. Vanessa told me that Trevor had actually been relieved when the wedding fell apart. He had been feeling pressured by his parents too, pushed toward a marriage and a lifestyle he wasn't sure he wanted. Without the wedding looming over them, they had been able to have honest conversations about what they actually wanted from their relationship. They had decided to take a step back, to date without the pressure of planning a future they weren't sure about. I told Vanessa about my own journey over the past 5 years, about learning to live alone and discovering that solitude could be peaceful rather than lonely, about building my garden and my teaching career and friendships that weren't based on keeping up appearances, about the hard work of figuring out who I was when I wasn't trying to be what someone else needed. We didn't fix everything in that one conversation. There were still hurt feelings and trust that needed to be rebuilt. But we made a start, and that felt like more than we had managed in years. Over the following months, Vanessa and I met regularly. Sometimes we talked about difficult things. Other times we just had lunch and discussed books or gardening or her job. She started therapy to work through her relationship with her father and the patterns she had learned from our family. I continued my own therapy, which I had started after the divorce but had maybe not taken seriously enough. Trevor came to one of our lunches about 3 months later. He was quieter than I had imagined, more thoughtful. He apologized for his part in the wedding situation and admitted that he had let his parents drive decisions that should have been between him and Vanessa. He said he was working on setting better boundaries with his family, which was harder than he had expected but necessary. I asked him about his intentions with my daughter, and he gave me an honest answer. He said he loved Vanessa but that they both had growing to do before they were ready for marriage. He said they were taking things slowly, learning to build a relationship based on who they actually were rather than who their families expected them to be. The legal situation resolved itself eventually. The vendors who had kept deposits wrote them off, rather than pursuing expensive litigation. Richard sent final letters clarifying that I bore no financial responsibility for any of the canceled contracts. David tried to sue me for damages, claiming I had intentionally sabotaged the wedding, but his case was thrown out when the evidence of fraud was presented. My relationship with Vanessa continued to improve slowly and with setbacks, but moving generally towards something healthier. She started standing up to David more, setting boundaries about when and how they communicated. She stopped trying to get me to reconcile with him or pretend that our marriage had been anything other than what it was. One Sunday afternoon, about 8 months after Christine's initial phone call, Vanessa came over to help me with the garden. We were planting new rose bushes, and she asked me why I loved gardening so much. I told her that I loved how roses required consistent care, but also resilience. That they needed pruning to grow properly, sometimes cutting away parts that looked healthy but were actually draining energy from the plant. Vanessa was quiet for a moment, then said that maybe our relationship had needed pruning too. That the painful cutting away of false expectations and resentments was making room for something stronger to grow. I looked at my daughter, dirt under her fingernails and hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and I saw someone I hadn't seen in years. Not the perfect daughter trying to please everyone. Not the angry young woman trying to punish me for perceived failures. Just Vanessa figuring out who she was and what she wanted. She told me that she and Trevor had decided to take a break. Not a breakup, but intentional time apart to work on themselves individually. She said she had realized she didn't actually know who she was outside of relationships, outside of trying to be what other people needed. She said she wanted to figure that out before she tried to build a life with someone else. I told her I was proud of her and I meant it. It takes courage to step back from a relationship that everyone expects you to pursue. It takes strength to choose uncertainty and growth over the comfort of meeting external expectations. She was choosing herself in a way I hadn't been able to do until I was in my 50s, and I hoped that early start would save her years of pain. We worked in the garden until sunset, talking and laughing and sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. As I watched Vanessa carefully tending the new rose bushes, making sure they had enough water and support to establish strong roots, I realized that this was what healing looked like. Not dramatic and sudden, but gradual and intentional. Small acts of care repeated consistently until something beautiful emerged. The wedding that never happened had been painful and expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. But it had also forced both Vanessa and me to confront patterns we had been avoiding for years. It had pruned away the pretense and exposed the truth underneath. And from that truth we were finally building something real. Now looking back, I'm grateful for Christine's phone call, even though it shattered my peace and exposed wounds I had tried to ignore. Sometimes the things that hurt us most are the things that finally force us to change. Sometimes the disasters we fear become the catalyst for the growth we need. I still tend my roses every day. Vanessa visits most Sundays and we work in the garden together. We're building something new between us, something rooted in honesty rather than obligation. It's not perfect and it never will be. But it's real and it's ours, and that's worth more than any wedding could ever be. The morning after Vanessa and I planted those rose bushes together, I woke up to 17 missed calls. All of them were from David. My stomach dropped as I scrolled through the call log, each timestamp showing his increasing persistence. He had started calling at 6 in the morning and hadn't stopped until nearly midnight. There were no voicemails, just the relentless pattern of someone who believed their need to speak to me outweighed my right to ignore them. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone and trying to decide whether to call him back. We hadn't spoken directly in almost 2 years, not since the final court appearance when the judge had dismissed his lawsuit against me. All our communication since then had gone through lawyers or, occasionally, through Vanessa when it concerned something about her. The fact that he was calling me directly repeatedly, without explanation, meant something had happened. My phone rang again. David's name flashed across the screen and I answered before I could talk myself out of it. His voice was different than I remembered, rougher somehow, like he had been drinking or not sleeping. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He told me we needed to talk about Vanessa immediately, that something serious had happened and it was partially my fault. I felt the old familiar tightness in my chest, the automatic response to his accusations that I had worked so hard to unlearn in therapy. I took a breath and asked him calmly what he was talking about. There was a pause, and then he said that Vanessa had told him she was cutting him out of her life. She had sent him an email the night before explaining that she needed space to work on herself, and that his constant criticism and manipulation had damaged her in ways she was only now beginning to understand. David's voice cracked as he read portions of the email to me. Vanessa had written about growing up afraid of disappointing him, about learning to hide parts of herself that didn't fit his vision of the perfect daughter, about the ways his treatment of me during the marriage had taught her that women existed to manage men's emotions. She had written that she loved him but couldn't have a relationship with him until he was willing to acknowledge the harm he had caused and take real steps to change. He finished reading and there was silence on the line. Then he asked me what I had said to her, what poison I had put in her head to turn her against him. The accusation was so predictable, so perfectly David, that I almost laughed. Even now, faced with his daughter's pain, his first instinct was to blame me rather than look at his own behavior. I told him I hadn't said anything to Vanessa, that she had come to these realizations on her own through therapy and reflection. I told him that maybe instead of blaming me, he should actually read what she had written and consider whether there might be truth in it. David's voice went cold in that way it used to before he would give me the silent treatment for days. He said I had always been good at playing the victim, at making myself seem reasonable while slowly poisoning everyone against him. He said that Vanessa had been fine until I had refused to pay for her wedding, that my selfishness and vindictiveness had created a wedge between Vanessa and everyone who actually cared about her. He said I should be ashamed of myself for using my daughter's mental health struggles as a way to get back at him for the divorce. The words were designed to hurt, and they did, but not in the way they used to. I had spent years in therapy learning to recognize manipulation, and I could see this conversation for what it was. David wasn't calling because he was worried about Vanessa. He was calling because he needed someone to blame for his own failures as a father. I told him that if he wanted to repair his relationship with Vanessa, he should probably start by respecting her boundaries and considering her perspective. Then I ended the call before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but I felt oddly proud of myself. 5 years ago, I would have spent hours defending myself, trying to make him understand, taking responsibility for his anger. Now I could simply hang up. Vanessa called me an hour later. Her voice was thick with tears and she asked if David had contacted me. I told her about the phone call and she started apologizing immediately. She said she hadn't meant to cause problems between us, that she should have warned me he would probably try to blame me. I stopped her and said she had nothing to apologize for. that setting boundaries with her father was her decision to make, and that I supported her completely. She was quiet for a moment before saying that sending the email had been one of the hardest things she had ever done. She said she had written and deleted it probably 20 times over the past month. Her therapist had encouraged her to be honest about her feelings, but actually putting them in words and sending them felt like jumping off a cliff. She had no idea if David would respond with anger or dismissal, or actually take her words seriously. I asked her what she hoped would happen, and she said she honestly didn't know. Part of her wanted him to read the email and have some kind of epiphany, to finally understand how his behavior had affected her and commit to changing. But another part of her knew that was unlikely, that David had spent 60 years building walls around his ego, and wasn't going to suddenly become self-aware because his daughter asked him to. We talked for over an hour about fathers and daughters, and the complicated grief of recognizing that your parent might never be capable of giving you what you need. Vanessa said her therapist had used the term ambiguous loss to describe the experience of mourning someone who was still alive but emotionally unavailable. She said it felt like that, like grieving the father she wished she had while trying to accept the father she actually got. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. I had spent years mourning the marriage I thought I had, the partnership I believed David and I were building, only to realize that my version of our relationship had never matched his. He had seen me as a supporting character in his life story, while I had foolishly believed we were co-authors of something shared. Vanessa asked me how I had gotten past the anger after the divorce, how I had moved from rage and hurt to something resembling peace. I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't really gotten past it so much as learned to carry it differently. The anger was still there sometimes, but it didn't control me anymore. I had learned to feel it, acknowledge it, and then let it move through me instead of setting up permanent residence in my chest. She asked if I ever regretted staying with David as long as I did, and I had to think about that. Yes and no, I told her. I regretted the years I spent making myself smaller, the opportunities one had passed up, the friendships I had let wither because David didn't approve of them. But I didn't regret having her, and I didn't regret the lessons I had eventually learned about my own strength and resilience. Sometimes the long way around is the only way we learn what we need to know. Vanessa said she was scared that she had already wasted too much time trying to please people who would never be satisfied. She was 29 years old and felt like she was just now figuring out basic things about herself that other people seemed to know instinctively. I reminded her that I was 57 before I really started living authentically, so she was already decades ahead of me. Over the next few weeks, I watched Vanessa navigate the fallout from her email to David. He responded eventually, with a long message that managed to be both defensive and dismissive. He acknowledged that their relationship had been imperfect, but suggested that Vanessa was being overly sensitive and allowing her therapist to implant false memories. He said that if she wanted to throw away their relationship over perceived slights from her childhood, that was her choice, but he wouldn't apologize for being a strict parent who had high standards. Vanessa showed me the email and asked what I thought. I told her that his response was actually a gift, even though it didn't feel like one. It was clarity. She now knew exactly who her father was and what he was capable of offering. She could stop hoping he would change and start deciding what kind of relationship, if any, she wanted with the person he actually was rather than the person she wished he would become. She nodded slowly and said her therapist had said something similar. That acceptance didn't mean approval. It just meant seeing reality clearly. She could accept that David was incapable of the kind of emotional accountability she needed without accepting his treatment of her as okay. She could grieve the father she didn't have while setting boundaries with the father she did have. During this time, I also heard from Patricia Winters, Trevor's mother. She called me on a Thursday afternoon and her voice had lost all its careful warmth from our previous conversation. She told me that Trevor and Vanessa had broken up, and that she held me personally responsible. According to Patricia, I had poisoned Vanessa's mind against Trevor's family by refusing to pay for the wedding, creating conflict where there should have been celebration. I let her talk for a while, listening to her catalog of complaints about how I had raised Vanessa and why my parenting failures had led to this outcome. When she finally paused for breath, I asked her if she was finished. The question seemed to surprise her. She said excuse me in a tone that suggested people didn't usually interrupt her monologues. I told her that I understood she was disappointed about Trevor and Vanessa's breakup, but that it wasn't my responsibility to manage her feelings about her son's relationships. Patricia's voice went icy. She said that Trevor had been planning to propose to Vanessa before I had interfered. That they had been happy together until I had created drama around the wedding and made Vanessa question everything. She said that Trevor was heartbroken and that I should be ashamed of destroying a good relationship because of my own bitterness. I asked her if Trevor had told her he was heartbroken or if she was projecting her own disappointment onto him. There was a long silence before Patricia said that a mother knows when her child is suffering. I told her that was true, which was why I knew Vanessa was actually doing better than she had in years. That sometimes the end of a relationship was the beginning of growth, not a tragedy to be mourned. Patricia said I was delusional if I thought Vanessa would find anyone better than Trevor. That my daughter was difficult and damaged and lucky that Trevor had been willing to overlook her family situation. The words were meant to wound, and in the past they might have. But I had heard similar things from David for 20 years, and I had learned that people who spoke that way were revealing their own character, not making accurate assessments of mine or my daughter's worth. I told Patricia that I hoped Trevor found someone who made him happy, and that I wished her family well. Then I ended the call. I didn't block her number because I wanted to see if she would try again, but she never did. I mentioned the conversation to Vanessa during our next visit, and she just shook her head. She said Patricia had called her too, with a similar message about how she was throwing away her future. Vanessa had been more blunt than I had been, telling Patricia that any future that required her to erase her own mother and forge legal documents wasn't a future worth having. The relief in Vanessa's voice when she talked about being free from Trevor's family expectations was palpable. She said she hadn't realized how much energy she had been spending trying to fit their vision of the perfect daughter-in-law until she stopped trying. It was like putting down a heavy backpack she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. She told me that Trevor had actually reached out to her a week after their breakup. He had apologized for the way his family had treated her, and admitted that he had known all along that excluding me from the wedding was wrong. He had gone along with it because fighting his parents felt impossible, and it was easier to rationalize their demands than to stand up to them. He said he understood why she had ended things, and that he hoped they could eventually be friends. Vanessa said she appreciated the apology but wasn't ready for friendship yet. She needed time to figure out who she was without constantly adjusting herself to fit someone else's expectations. Trevor had said he understood, and they had left things open-ended. Maybe someday they would reconnect, but for now they both needed space to grow separately. I asked Vanessa what she was learning about herself in all this space she was creating, and she laughed. She said it was embarrassing how little she actually knew about her own preferences and desires. She had spent so long being what other people needed that her own wants had become background noise she barely registered. Her therapist had started asking her questions like, what kind of music do you like when no one else is around? What would you do with a free Saturday if you didn't have to consider anyone else's opinion? What makes you feel alive rather than just occupied? Vanessa said she had cried during that therapy session because she didn't have good answers to any of those questions. She had built her entire identity around being a good daughter, a good girlfriend, a good employee, but she had no idea how to just be Vanessa. Her therapist had given her homework to spend time alone doing things without purpose or productivity, just exploring what felt good to her body and spirit. It sounded like the kind of assignment that would have terrified me at her age, and I told her so. She smiled and said it was terrifying now too, but also exciting. She had started small, going to a coffee shop alone with no book or phone, and just sitting there noticing what she noticed. Taking walks without a destination. Cooking meals based on what sounded good rather than what was healthy or efficient. They were tiny acts of rebellion against a lifetime of optimization and people-pleasing. I shared some of my own journey toward self-discovery after the divorce. How I had joined a pottery class because I had always been curious about it, only to discover I was terrible at pottery and that was okay. How I had let my garden become wild and overgrown for an entire summer, just to see what would happen when I stopped trying to control every bloom and branch. How I had learned to eat dinner at 9 at night if that's when I felt hungry, to leave dishes in the sink until morning, to wear the same shirt 3 days in a row if it felt comfortable. Vanessa laughed and said those things sounded so simple, but felt revolutionary when you had spent your whole life performing competence for an audience. She said she had recently worn mismatched socks to work, and felt like she was getting away with something dangerous. Her coworker had pointed them out and Vanessa had just shrugged and said she liked them that way. It was such a small thing, but it felt like practice for bigger acts of authenticity. We talked about the difference between loneliness and solitude, and how learning to be alone without feeling lonely was maybe the most important skill either of us had developed. Vanessa said she was starting to understand why I had seemed so content living by myself these past few years. She had always thought I must be sad or incomplete without a partner, but now she was realizing that solitude could be a choice rather than a consolation prize. I told her that I had been lonely in my marriage to David and peaceful in my home alone, which taught me that the presence of another person guaranteed nothing about your emotional state. That real connection required both people to show up authentically, and that was impossible when one or both of you were performing a role. Vanessa said her therapist had used almost the same language when talking about her relationship patterns. As spring turned into summer, I watched Vanessa slowly unfurl like one of my roses opening to the sun. She cut her hair short, which she had been wanting to do for years, but David had always told her long hair was more feminine. She started taking art classes at the community center, even though she claimed to have no talent. She adopted an elderly cat from the shelter, a grumpy orange tabby named Chester, who had been overlooked by everyone looking for kittens. She brought Chester to meet me one Sunday, and the cat immediately claimed my favorite garden chair as his new throne. Vanessa laughed and said Chester had excellent taste. We sat in the garden while the cat supervised our work, and Vanessa told me about her job. She had been feeling increasingly unfulfilled by marketing work, selling products she didn't believe in to people who didn't need them. She had started looking into career changes but felt paralyzed by the practical concerns. She had student loans and rent and now a cat who needed regular vet care. I asked her what she would do if money wasn't a factor, and she immediately said she would want to work with young women who were struggling with family trauma or relationship abuse. She wanted to be the kind of mentor she wished she had when she was younger, someone who could help girls recognize manipulation and build healthy boundaries before they wasted years trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it freely. The passion in her voice was unmistakable, and I told her she should pursue it. She said she couldn't afford to go back to school for a counseling degree, and besides, who would hire her when she was still figuring out her own life? I reminded her that sometimes the best teachers are the ones still actively learning, that her lived experience with family dysfunction and people-pleasing was more valuable than any textbook knowledge could be. We started researching options together. Vanessa could get certified as a life coach or peer counselor without going back for a full degree. She could volunteer at domestic violence shelters or youth organizations to build experience while keeping her current job. She could start a blog or social media presence, sharing what she was learning about breaking generational patterns and setting boundaries. The possibilities multiplied as we brainstormed, and I watched Vanessa's face light up with something I hadn't seen there in years. Hope, purpose, direction. She started volunteering at a local women's shelter 2 evenings a week, answering phones on their crisis line. The training was intense and sometimes triggering as she heard stories that reminded her of her own family patterns. But she said it felt meaningful in a way her marketing job never had. She was helping women find resources to leave dangerous situations, connecting them with legal aid and housing assistance and counseling services. She was quite literally saving lives, or at least giving people the tools to save themselves. One evening after her shift, Vanessa came to my house shaking. She had talked to a woman whose husband controlled all the money, who had to account for every penny, who had been saving grocery money in secret for years trying to build enough to leave. The parallels to my own story were obvious and painful. Vanessa asked me how I had survived it, how I had kept going when every day felt like walking through a minefield. I told her the truth, which was that some days I hadn't kept going very well, that there were nights I cried in the shower so David wouldn't hear. That there were years when I seriously considered just accepting that this was my life and trying to want less, feel less, be less. But I had also found small acts of resistance that kept me tethered to myself. Writing in journals that I hid in the garage, buying flowers for myself and claiming they were on sale, teaching my students about their worth and pretending I believed I had worth too, until slowly that pretending became real. Vanessa cried as I talked and I cried too. We were grieving together. Not just for what we had each lost but for all the women we knew, and didn't know who were still losing themselves in relationships that demanded their diminishment as the price of admission. The woman on the crisis line was just one of thousands, and sitting with that reality was almost unbearable. But Vanessa said something that night that stuck with me. She said that every woman who got out broke the pattern for someone else. That me leaving David had eventually made it possible for her to leave Trevor, even though years and different circumstances separated those decisions. That the woman on the crisis line, if she managed to escape, would be teaching her daughter or sister or friend that escape was possible. That we were all connected in this vast network of women learning and relearning that we deserved to take up space. Summer passed into early fall, and Vanessa seemed to grow more solid in herself with each passing week. She had started posting on social media about her journey of unlearning people-pleasing behaviors, and her content was resonating with more people than either of us expected. Women of all ages were commenting about their own experiences, sharing stories of controlling partners or impossible family expectations, or the exhausting work of being perfect. Vanessa created a small online community for women working on similar issues, and it quickly grew to several hundred members. They shared resources and encouragement and honest accounts of their struggles. Vanessa spent hours moderating discussions and responding to messages, doing it all in addition to her day job and volunteer work. I worried she was taking on too much, but she said it didn't feel like work. It felt like the thing she was meant to be doing. One October afternoon, Vanessa called me with news. She had been offered a full-time position at the women's shelter, coordinating their peer support programs, and developing their crisis intervention training. The salary was less than she made in marketing, but it included benefits and the opportunity to do meaningful work full-time. She wanted to take it but was scared of the financial uncertainty. We talked through her budget together. With the lower salary, she would need to move to a cheaper apartment and cut back on discretionary spending. She wouldn't be able to save as much each month, but she would also be doing work that aligned with her values, and using her trauma to help others instead of selling products for a corporation that didn't care about her. When we looked at it that way, the choice seemed obvious. Vanessa gave her notice at the marketing firm and started her new job in November. She moved into a smaller apartment closer to the shelter, downsizing from a 2-bedroom to a studio. She said it was an adjustment, living in such a small space, but it also felt freeing. She had less stuff to maintain, less space to keep perfect. Chester the cat didn't seem to mind either way as long as his food bowl stayed full. I helped her move, and as we unpacked boxes in her new place, I noticed something. Vanessa had hung photos on her walls, pictures of the two of us from various stages of her childhood and recent months. There were no photos of David. No pictures from her relationship with Trevor. Just images of her authentic life, the moments where she had been allowed to be fully herself. She caught me looking and smiled. She said she had spent so much of her life trying to curate an image that would make other people happy that her walls had been covered with photos that represented who she was supposed to be rather than who she was. Now she wanted her space to reflect her truth, even if that truth was still evolving. November brought Thanksgiving, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel anxious about the holiday. When Vanessa and I were barely speaking, Thanksgiving had been awkward and tense, both of us performing gratitude we didn't feel. This year, Vanessa asked if we could host a Friendsgiving instead of a traditional family dinner. She invited some of the women from the shelter who didn't have family to spend the holiday with, and I invited my sister Julia and a few neighbors I had grown close to. We cooked together in my kitchen, the house full of laughter and music and the comfortable chaos of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. There were no formal place settings or assigned seats. People ate wherever they felt comfortable, and the conversation flowed easily without anyone trying to control or direct it. At one point, I looked around my living room at this collection of women of different ages and backgrounds who had all survived something difficult, and I felt overwhelmingly grateful. One of the shelter residents, a young woman named Keisha, asked Vanessa how she had built such a good relationship with her mother. Keisha said her own mother still talked to her abusive ex-boyfriend and chose him over her own daughter's safety. Vanessa looked at me across the room and smiled before answering. She said our relationship wasn't always good, that we had gone through years of barely speaking because we were both caught in unhealthy patterns. But we had done the hard work of being honest with each other and ourselves, and that had made space for something real to grow. Keisha asked what the hard work looked like, and Vanessa didn't sugarcoat it. She talked about therapy and uncomfortable conversations, and the painful process of letting go of who she thought she was supposed to be. She talked about confronting her father and setting boundaries that felt cruel but were necessary. She talked about forgiving me for mistakes I made while also holding me accountable for doing better. It was messy and ongoing and sometimes felt impossible, but it was worth it. I added that the work wasn't just Vanessa's to do, that I had to own my failures as a parent and do my own healing so I could show up differently for her, that I had to learn to stop protecting her from discomfort and start trusting her to handle her own difficult emotions, that I had to release my guilt about the past enough to be present in our current relationship. Keisha nodded thoughtfully, and I could see her processing whether that kind of repair might be possible with her own mother someday. After everyone left that night, Vanessa and I cleaned up together. She was washing dishes and I was drying, and she said quietly that this had been her favorite Thanksgiving ever. I asked her why, and she said because for the first time she had felt like she could be completely herself without performing or managing anyone's expectations. She hadn't worried about saying the right thing or being the right way. She had just been Vanessa, and that had been enough. I told her that watching her come into herself over the past year had been one of the greatest gifts of my life, that I was sorry I hadn't been able to give her that freedom earlier, but I was grateful we had found our way to it eventually. She turned from the sink with soapy hands and hugged me, and we stood there in my kitchen holding each other while Chester wound around our ankles demanding attention. December brought an unexpected email. It was from Trevor, asking if we could meet for coffee. He said he had some things he wanted to say to me in person, things he felt he owed me after everything that had happened with the wedding. I showed the email to Vanessa and asked what she thought. She said it was my decision, but she was curious what he wanted to say. She also warned me that his mother had been apparently asking him to reconcile with her, so this might be an attempt to win Vanessa back through me. I decided to meet him, mostly out of curiosity. We met at a neutral coffee shop on a cold Tuesday morning. Trevor looked different than I remembered from the few times I had seen him. Thinner maybe, or just less polished. He thanked me for agreeing to meet and then spent several minutes apologizing. He said he had been thinking a lot about the wedding situation and his role in it. That he should have stood up to his parents when they suggested excluding me. That he should have questioned why Vanessa felt she needed to forge signatures instead of asking me directly. He said breaking up with Vanessa had forced him to look at his own patterns of avoiding conflict and letting his parents make decisions that should have been his. He had started therapy, which his mother had dismissed as self-indulgent but which he found necessary. He said his therapist had helped him see that his relationship with Vanessa had been built on both of them trying to be perfect versions of themselves rather than their authentic selves. I asked him why he was telling me this, and he said because he owed me an apology and also because he wanted me to know that Vanessa's growth hadn't been for nothing. That watching her choose herself had inspired him to start choosing himself too. That even though their relationship had ended, she had given him the gift of seeing another way to live. He said he hoped that eventually they might be friends, but he wasn't reaching out to her until he had done more work on himself. I appreciated his honesty and told him so. I asked about his parents and he grimaced. He said setting boundaries with them was the hardest thing he had ever done. They had responded with guilt trips and manipulation and threats to cut him off financially, which they had partially followed through on. But he was learning to support himself and finding that the freedom was worth more than their money. We talked for over an hour, and by the end I understood why Vanessa had cared about him. There was something genuine in Trevor when he wasn't trying to meet impossible standards. I told him I hoped he continued his growth, and that if he and Vanessa eventually reconnected as friends, I would support that. But I also told him that Vanessa was building something important right now, and she needed space to do that without interference. He said he understood and thanked me again for meeting with him. As we parted ways, I felt a strange sense of peace about the whole situation. The wedding that had caused so much pain and chaos had ultimately pushed everyone involved toward necessary growth. Sometimes destruction was actually creation in disguise, clearing away what didn't work to make room for what might. I told Vanessa about the meeting with Trevor, and she listened quietly. When I finished, she said she was glad he was doing his own work, but she wasn't ready to reconnect. That she needed more time to solidify her sense of self before navigating any relationship with him, even friendship. I told her that was wise and that there was no rush. Some bridges needed to stay burned for a while before you could decide whether rebuilding them was worthwhile. Christmas approached and Vanessa asked what I wanted to do for the holiday. I suggested we create our own traditions instead of following the patterns from her childhood. We decided to volunteer at the shelter on Christmas morning, serving breakfast to residents and their children. Then we would come back to my house for a simple meal, just the two of us and Chester the cat, and spend the afternoon doing whatever felt good in the moment. Christmas morning was beautiful in unexpected ways. The shelter had been decorated by volunteers, and there was music playing and children laughing. We served eggs and pancakes and fruit to women who were rebuilding their lives one day at a time. Several of them recognized Vanessa from her work at the shelter and hugged her, thanking her for the ways she had helped them. I watched my daughter in her element, present and open and so clearly aligned with her purpose, and I felt proud in a way I had never felt when she was achieving traditional markers of success. After we left the shelter, we stopped by the cemetery where my mother was buried. I hadn't been there in over a year, but something made me want to visit on Christmas. Vanessa had never really known her grandmother, who had died when Vanessa was just a baby. We stood at the grave and I told Vanessa stories about my mother that I had never shared before. About how she had stayed in an unhappy marriage too, how she had taught me through her example that women were supposed to sacrifice and endure. I told Vanessa that I wished my mother had left my father, that I wished she had shown me that women could choose themselves, that staying wasn't the only option. But I also understood now that she had done the best she could with the tools and knowledge she had, that I couldn't blame her for not knowing what she was never taught. Vanessa asked if I thought we had finally broken the pattern, and I said I hoped so, that she was breaking it by choosing differently at 29 instead of 57, that every generation that did slightly better than the last was progress, even if it was slower than we wanted. We drove home through the quiet Christmas streets and spent the afternoon reading in my living room while Chester alternated between our laps. It was simple and peaceful and exactly what both of us needed. No performance, no stress, no trying to create magazine-worthy memories. Just presence and contentment, and the deep satisfaction of being with someone who saw you completely and loved you anyway. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed since Christine the wedding planner had called me that day in my garden. The crisis that had felt like the end of everything had actually been a beginning. It had forced conversations that needed to happen and revelations that needed to surface. It had pushed both Vanessa and me toward growth we might have avoided if things had stayed comfortable. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, still carrying so much unexamined pain and passing it on to my daughter without meaning to. I thought about Vanessa a year ago, so desperate for approval that she was willing to forge documents and erase her own mother from her wedding. We were both different people now, still imperfect and still learning, but moving in a direction that felt true. On New Year's Eve, Vanessa came over with a bottle of sparkling cider and a list she had made. She said her therapist had suggested reflecting on the past year by writing down what she was grateful for and what she was releasing. We sat at my kitchen table and made our lists together, reading them aloud to each other as midnight approached. Vanessa's gratitude list included her new job, her friendships with the women from the shelter, Chester the cat, therapy, our healed relationship, and her emerging sense of self. Her release list included the need to be perfect, the fear of disappointing people, Trevor and the wedding that never happened, her father's approval, and the belief that she was responsible for managing other people's emotions. My gratitude list included Vanessa's courage, my garden, Julia's steady support, the financial freedom David's death had given me, and the discovery that it wasn't too late to become who I was meant to be. My release list included guilt about the past, fear of Vanessa's judgment, the habit of making myself small, David's voice in my head telling me I wasn't enough, and the belief that love required self-sacrifice. We burned our release lists in my fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken as the flames consumed the words. It felt ceremonial and cleansing, letting go of patterns and beliefs that had served us once but now only limited our growth. As midnight struck and fireworks exploded somewhere in the distance, we hugged and cried and laughed at how dramatic we were being. But the drama felt earned. We had both survived a year of profound change and come out stronger on the other side. We had faced hard truths and made difficult choices. We had prioritized our healing over other people's comfort. We had chosen authenticity over approval, and that choice had cost us relationships but given us ourselves. Vanessa stayed over that night, sleeping in her old room that I had kept mostly unchanged since she moved out years ago. In the morning I made us breakfast and we ate in comfortable silence, both of us tired but content. She said she felt hopeful about the new year in a way she couldn't remember feeling before. That she was excited to see who she would become as she continued this work of unbecoming who she was supposed to be. I told her I felt the same way. That even at 57, I was still discovering new aspects of myself and learning what brought me joy. That growth didn't have an age limit or an expiration date. That we were both proof that it was never too late to start choosing yourself. As Vanessa drove away that afternoon, I stood in my driveway and watched until her car disappeared around the corner. Then I went inside to my quiet house, my peaceful garden visible through the windows, and I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Complete contentment with exactly who and where I was. No longing for different circumstances or different choices. Just deep appreciation for the long winding path that had brought me home to myself. The wedding that never happened had been the catalyst for so much healing. The crisis had cracked us both open and let light into places we had kept carefully dark. Now we were learning to live in that light, stumbling sometimes but moving generally forward. Together but separate. Connected but independent. Mother and daughter, but also two women on parallel journeys toward wholeness. And that felt like enough. More than enough. Felt like everything. The call came on a Tuesday in March, 18 months after that first phone call from Christine the wedding planner. This time it was Vanessa, and her voice held an excitement I hadn't heard before. She told me she had been offered a promotion at the shelter, director of their entire peer support program. It meant more responsibility and better pay, and the chance to shape how they helped women rebuild their lives. I congratulated her and asked when she wanted to celebrate. She laughed and said she actually wanted to talk to me about something else first. There was a pause, and then she told me that Trevor had reached out again. They had been talking occasionally as friends, and he had asked if she wanted to have dinner with him to catch up properly. I asked how she felt about that and she said she wasn't sure. She didn't want to fall back into old patterns, but she also recognized that both of them had changed significantly. Her therapist had asked her what she wanted from reconnecting with him, and Vanessa realized she genuinely missed his friendship. Not the performance they had done together, but the person underneath that she had caught glimpses of. She said this time would be different because she was different. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her or fix her or validate her worth. She was whole on her own and interested in seeing if they could build something real between two whole people instead of two halves trying to merge. I told her that sounded remarkably healthy and mature. Vanessa asked what I thought about her seeing Trevor again, and I realized my opinion held less weight than it once would have. Not because we weren't close, but because she trusted herself now. She was asking for my perspective, not my permission. I told her I thought she should follow her curiosity and trust that she would know if it stopped feeling right. Spring arrived and my garden exploded with color. Vanessa came over most weekends, sometimes bringing Trevor with her. He had changed too, softer somehow and more present. They were taking things slowly, building friendship before anything else. I watched them together and saw something fundamentally different from their earlier relationship. They disagreed openly now, voiced different preferences, took up space without apologizing. It looked healthier. David sent a letter in April. Not to me but to Vanessa, though she brought it to show me. He had written that he was ready to talk if she was, that he had been thinking about what she said and wanted to understand better. Vanessa said his language was still defensive, still focused on his intent rather than her impact, but it was more than she expected from him. She wrote back, carefully and with her therapist's help. She told him she was open to rebuilding their relationship, but it would require him to listen without defending himself, and acknowledge the harm his behavior had caused. She said she loved him but couldn't have a relationship that required her to pretend the past didn't happen. David never responded to that letter. The silence was its own answer, and Vanessa grieved it. But she also moved forward, understanding that she could only control her own choices. She had extended the invitation for healing, and he had declined it. That was his loss, not her failure. Summer brought Vanessa's 30th birthday. We celebrated in my garden with close friends, women from the shelter and Julia and a few of Vanessa's coworkers. Trevor was there too, and I watched him help set up tables and chat easily with everyone. When someone asked how long they had been together, Vanessa corrected them gently. They were dating but taking it slow, she said. Learning to build something sustainable instead of rushing toward traditional milestones. As the sun set and candles flickered on the tables, Vanessa pulled me aside. She thanked me for everything over the past 2 years, for setting boundaries when it would have been easier to give in, for doing my own healing work, for showing her what it looked like to choose yourself even when it was hard. I told her she had taught me just as much. That watching her courage had inspired my own. That we had healed each other by being willing to be honest, even when honesty hurt. She hugged me and we stood there in my garden, surrounded by roses I had planted and tended, and sometimes neglected but which had grown beautiful anyway. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my garden and thought about everything that had changed. The wedding that never happened had seemed like a disaster, but it had actually been a gift. It had forced us both to confront patterns we might have carried forever. It had pushed us toward growth we might have avoided if things had stayed comfortable. I thought about Christine, the wedding planner, and her phone call that had shattered my peace. I had been so angry at the time, so hurt by Vanessa's deception. But that moment of crisis had been exactly what we both needed. Sometimes love means letting things fall apart, so they can be rebuilt on honest foundations. My phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Just a photo of Chester the cat sleeping in a sunbeam, with a caption that said she was grateful for boring Tuesday nights in her small apartment with her grumpy cat. I smiled and sent back a photo of my garden, the roses in full bloom, and told her I was grateful too. Grateful for the long way around. Grateful for the hard conversations. Grateful for the breaking and the rebuilding. Grateful that we had both survived becoming ourselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.